This is What If I Told You, the event psychology video podcast for event professionals, in which Victoria Mady, event consultant and host, talks with the world's top minds in behavioral science, neuroscience, and psychology on how to transform events using insights about human behavior and mind.
Hello, I'm Victoria Mady, and this is What If I Told You, the event psychology podcast, where I talk all things event psychology, that is how to apply behavioral science, brain science insights in events. And today my guest is Bri Williams. Bri is an expert in buying behavior, how to apply behavioral science to customer purchasing patterns so you maximize every dollar of marketing spend. And Bri is a CPA with a degree in applied psychology. She founded People Partners in 2011, and this is a specialist consultancy that helps businesses maximize their chances of influencing customers and stakeholders. And before that, she worked in finance, HR, and product management for some of Australia's leading brands. She's also a regular contributor to Smartcompany and MarketingMag, and she has written 5 books, including Behavioural Economics for Business and 22 Minutes to a Better Business. And she appears regularly as a presenter, panellist, and media commentator. Welcome, Bri. Thank you for coming.
Oh, absolute pleasure, Victoria. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
For those of you watching first time, I met Bri first time when she spoke at the Nudge Talk Festival. And this is a behavioral science event organized by Ogilvy Consulting. And I should say, if I were to name one silver lining to the pandemic in the context of events, it would be that it gave me, along with a few hundred other people, the opportunity to tune into Nudge Talk, which I think went online first in 2020. And that's how people all over the world, got to learn and got the access to the best minds in behavioral science. And Bri, I recall when you did your presentation at Nudge Talk, you mentioned 3 behavioral barriers that are important to understand if we want people to move from point A, that is what they are currently doing, to point B, that is what we want them to do. And those 3 are included into your influencing action framework, right?
Yes, that's right. So, and Nudge Talk is a great resource. So it usually is around, is it May and June every year? So keep an eye posted for that. But so everything in business, I believe, comes back to behaviour. So whether that's the behaviour of our colleagues or our suppliers or, of course, our customers, our boss, whomever it is. But most of our day is spent trying to get other people to do things. So for a customer, it might be clicking a button or turning up to an event. For colleagues, it might be contributing to a project that you think is important, but maybe they don't. So all roads lead to behaviour. And because for so many years we've been going about it in the wrong way, and many organisations still are, people get very frustrated. So you waste a lot of time and effort in your work because you're not effectively getting people to do what you would like them to do. So my behavioural change model, which you're talking about, really starts from the basics of our task in business, whether it's event management or any other role, is to influence people from doing what they're currently doing to what we would like them to do. And the 3 barriers that you mentioned are the 3 things that stand in our way. And whilst we often think humans are very complicated and it can feel very daunting to try and approach behaviour change, these 3 things are universals. So you can use them on any individual or you can use them in any sort of group. So those 3 barriers, which we might have we might go through. We'll see where the conversation ends. But the 3 barriers, the first is that people are lazy. Now, this means that they just don't want to think too hard about what you're asking them to do. So they can't be bothered. It takes them away from their habits. It takes them away from what they're comfortable with, for instance. So laziness, it doesn't mean they're not intelligent. And I'm not using lazy in the traditional sitting on the couch sense. It's really that in order to get through our day, we automate most of our decision making, and we save up our precious brain power for the very important decisions. And so most of the time we make fast decisions and we get on with life. So laziness is the first thing, getting our customer or our colleague to bother. The second barrier is overwhelm or confusion. So they might want to do what we're asking of them, but they're getting confused. And in events, a classic example is a program. So people will look at the program of a conference and they won't know where to start. So overwhelm is the second problem. And the third problem is fear. So people might be scared to take the action that you're wanting them to. So even when it comes to clicking a button, if I don't know what that button on that website does, I'm not going to click the button. And so when we think about our work, we can think about, if I want to get people from what they're currently doing to what I want them to do, is it a problem of laziness? Is it a problem of overwhelm? Or is it a problem of fear? Or maybe it's a combination of all 3. So that's the model that I use to help my clients work through.
Fantastic. And what do you think is the most important element, or the most strong barrier of those that you mentioned, or that you have in that model, that, or maybe the one that should be the first priority to tackle, in events or generally marketing? Because,
so
we need something Victoria, to start with, right?
Yes, that's right. If I'm going to get your listeners and watchers to move from point A, not using behavioural science, to using behavioural science, I need to help them overcome laziness, overwhelm and fear. The answer really will depend on the situation and the point at which you are engaging with people. So if you think about it generally, our first problem is usually laziness, because we're trying to engage people. We're trying to get them interested. So, for instance, if you're launching an event, how are you going to engage people to even bother to read your marketing, to then move on to, ticketing and all the sorts of things that flow from that? So laziness is usually at the start, although it can affect the whole chain of events. The barrier that is least often talked about is fear, because it's unlikely for a customer to tell you, for instance, I would have purchased from you, but I was nervous about doing so. I was nervous that if I made the wrong decision, I would look silly in front of my colleagues or silly in front of my spouse. So fear is often the one that is unspoken, but we need to anticipate that it will be there. And the problem often in business is that we think our product or our service or our event, why wouldn't you want to come? It's great. There's nothing to fear. There is no downside. And yet that's not the case from the customer's perspective. So even when I'm thinking about events, I might have a fear that I don't know where to park my car, or I don't know how to catch public transport to where the event is being held. And that might be enough to stop me from bothering to purchase tickets.
Right. I think I actually have a question for you that refers to that point about fear. So we will talk about it later. Now, I work with event professionals, and over the last few years, I've been focusing on showing how event business can benefit from behavioral science findings. But as obvious as it may seem, it has not been adopted on a mass scale yet. So I thought I would ask you this. Why do you think so few businesses take advantage of behavioral economics insights?
Well, in fact, my latest YouTube clip was on this very topic, because I think the irony is that behavioral science, or the science of influence, hasn't been able to influence people to use influence. I find it fascinating that, and often, for instance, watching conferences like Nudge Doc, a lot of the behavioural scientists are not using behavioural science to engage their audience in how they're presenting. So in answer to your question, why people are not taking up behavioural science is because they are lazy, scared and overwhelmed. And it's mainly because of laziness, because what we're asking of people is to change what they're currently doing and to do something different. So that's effortful. And if we're not clear on what the reward is, and the reward has to be much greater than the effort, people are going to revert to how they normally conduct their business. So the same issues in any business, like us in behavioural science, if we want to engage people in the use of behavioural science, we need to move them from point A to point B, and we need to work through laziness, overwhelm and fear in order to get our customers to use our services.
Right. And related to that, actually, what I notice instead, that a lot of businesses rely on market research. And in fact, one of your recent videos on YouTube explores just that topic. And I loved it. You know, you are so spot on that. We don't need behavioral economics. We already do market research thing, you know. In the events industry, I see it way too often. People are obsessed with collecting opinions and relying on those numbers and opinions to determine their next business move. So they are relying on market research, and quite often, when we look back, it turns out that it was not enough. And I think this is what you meant by saying that past behavior is not a predictor of future behavior. So can you talk about why we should not rely solely on feedback and maybe observe more instead?
Yes, and I formed these views when I was working in the corporate sector. I was in product management, and we would commission a lot of focus groups, and we would have things like surveys, satisfaction surveys, or we would ask our potential customers what they wanted in our product. And if we adopted those findings, we found that very rarely would things change for the better. So there's a gap between what people say they'll do and what they say they want and what they actually do. And most market research, unfortunately, for us in business, is still stuck in the best thing to do is listen to customers. And I know you reference Adam Ferrier's work in some of your blogs. So Adam has a book on this and a talk on this. And I likewise have been speaking about it for years. There's something very compelling about hearing directly from your customer. So we like to hear from them because we think that's truth. And it's not that they're lying by any means. It's that they are giving you a response to a question, but asking them is very different from real behaviour. So in Australia, for instance, we have a campaign to buy Australian food. And so people in focus groups would say, yes, I intend to buy locally sourced tinned tomatoes. And yet when we go to the supermarket aisle and we see that the Italian tomatoes are much cheaper than the Australian tomatoes, we buy the Italian tomatoes. So market research, most market research, I should say, there are though market researchers that use behavioural economics, but a lot of market research that is based purely on listening to customers and asking customers either to explain what they have done in the past or what they will do in the future, it's not going to give you the answers you need in business. And that's why fields like behavioural economics are so important, because it shows us how people are wired to make decisions. And in my work, my codification, my distillation of behavioural economics is that people are lazy, scared and overwhelmed.
So speaking of feedback, it's still like it can be useful, right? So, and we are still collecting it, especially in events. It's a usual procedure, like doing it before the event and always post-event, right? And I recently heard from a colleague who struggles to even get that feedback, so it isn't a new challenge for the event organizers. It's been like we've been struggling, with this for forever. But I believe that it is becoming more difficult because of the volume of information and maybe pace of the online environment specifically. And so my colleague says that they have tried for one of the events, they have tried like everything. They've offered free registration and free hotel stays, gift cards, prizes, nothing works. And so her question is what to do, how to get people respond to a survey. So after the event, the survey is out to the attendees, and she is struggling to collect the responses.
Right. Well, setting aside the fact that surveys don't give you necessarily accurate information, if you are...
Yes, we will set that aside, but if we are collecting them, how can we make people actually respond?
Yes. Well, that becomes the art of the communication. And, that's a very long conversation for us to have, Victoria. But to me, it sounds like there could be a problem. Well, there's clearly a problem of laziness. So when I think of laziness, so your colleague is not engaging people in the survey. So they're either not even clicking on the email. I presume it's an email. Not clicking on the email, or if they are, they're not clicking the link to the survey. In the laziness barrier, we need to think of effort versus reward. So are we making it more difficult versus the reward they're getting? Now, I know the suggestion is that we've offered prizes and free accommodation and what have you. It's hard for me to comment without knowing what was in the subject line and how the inducement was presented. But always we need to answer to us to overcome laziness, the what's in it for me. Now, the what's in it for me can vary. It might not be money and it may not be gifts. It might be a human to human help us get, this information. Or it might be playing on the ego of the survey participant. They've been specially selected for this. So very hard to talk about what to do differently without knowing what they've tried and what it looks like. But that's how I would go about it. I would firstly look at lazy. Then I would look at overwhelm. So in that correspondence, how clear is the call to action? Are there too many avenues that we're asking them to think about? And then with fear, are they not clicking firstly, they're not clicking on the email because they're not sure who the email has come from. Or within the email itself, are they not sure what the button does? Or how long the survey will take them. So these are all things that your colleague needs to work through in order to optimize that opportunity to engage the customer.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. I do agree. I mean, I know that, it's a lot of tiny details that actually will affect the outcome, and we need to go step by step and tackle all of those.
The first thing to do is to understand if it's are people not even opening the email, in which case it's the subject line that you can then test. If they are clicking into the email, so the subject line is working, something in the body of the email isn't working. So that's how to start to focus the analysis.
Yeah, interesting, right? I think that in many cases, people don't pay attention to such small detail as a subject line, right?
And not only the subject line, but the sender's address. So, whether it's coming from a person's name or whether it's coming from survey at something, but the address line becomes really important. You're so right that everything we're talking about, it's about 1% changes. It's the tiny little details, because that's what people get stopped by. That the points of friction, the points of uncertainty, that's what kills business. Whilst we think that it's going to be, magical, well, if we only give them 2 nights accommodation, it's going to work. No, it's all of these tiny little micro yeses. We're trying to get micro yeses towards a bigger take up of whatever we're offering.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I have one question about another challenge. So the last 2 years have been a nightmare for the event industry. And although we kind of see some kind of comeback right now, I personally doubt that it's going to be a fast comeback, mainly because there is still a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about meeting face-to-face, for example. And even though we've got all those virtual tools and they are helpful, we've got a problem on that front as well, because people are generally overwhelmed and they suffer from Zoom fatigue, right? But without attendees, there are no events. And there is a lot of discussions and a lot of talks about how we convince people to attend events virtually or in person, because, again, without attendees, we just don't have the business, the industry. So do you think behavioral science can help struggling event planners, and how? If yes, how?
Well, that's your patch, Victoria. you know much more than I about behavioural science applied to events, but yes, it can help. Now, to my mind, the only way live events are going to thrive is to make sure the proposition for meeting in person is much greater than the benefits of sitting in your home space and not having to travel and what have you. So much like happened in education maybe 10 years ago, where there was some organisations started to flip the model, which is when students attended the school, that was where the great face-to-face work happened, and it was all about the community. Whereas the homework, was actually, that's when homework became the core module. So you would do most of your learning self-paced by yourself, and then come back to the group and make it come alive, I suppose. And I see events following that pattern. There has to be some differentiation between the virtual and the live in order to have people bother going to the live events. And I think it puts quite a lot of, I was going to say pressure, but I think the opportunity for presenters is to lift the game, because I think in terms of Zoom fatigue and what have you, a lot of that presenters are still presenting like they were at the start of the pandemic 2 years ago, and it's unacceptable, frankly. There needs to be an improvement in how we craft presentations, particularly live ones, so that people will attend events. Yeah.
And my next question was exactly about that, about presentations. So you host a series of interviews called Talking Talks, and where you guest share tips on public speaking. And also, I'm a big fan of your presentation style as well. It's always so engaging and memorable. So can you share some advice on how to make a session more engaging and memorable? Again, I know that there might be, tons of tips for that, but at least some key, maybe critical, or maybe something to start with.
And thank you for those nice comments. I think, well, a few tips. Focus on the feeling, not the facts. So your audience want to feel something rather than necessarily be informed. The confusion is that people think they're attending events so that they get information, and that's part of it, but it's how you deliver that information. And so, for instance, in my presentations, particularly those online or virtual, I wear props, I have hats, I have different ways of engaging so that it's not a flat presentation, because people just get sick of a talking head. So focus on the feeling, trying to overcome laziness, as I was talking about. And of course, you need to overcome overwhelm. So, and this is one of my own challenges. I tend to give too much content and then people get overwhelmed by it. And then the other barrier, of course, that we've been talking about is fear. And fear in a presentation, you need fear. You need people to feel a level of tension about the status quo, because otherwise they won't change their behaviour. So in an event, more broadly, it's fear of missing out. If I don't go to this event, so we can use tension or fear in a positive way to get people looking at their status quo and thinking, I really do need to resolve that challenge. And even in our conversation today, I started our conversation talking about frustrations people are having at work, because I want people to feel tension about how their current world is, because only then do we develop appetite for change. But with fear, it's a balancing act, because we want to give them fear enough to want to change, but not too much fear that the change itself is terrifying. So my tips with presentations: focus on the feeling and make sure that you've got the right amount of tension for people to be interested, but also confident to want to inquire more.
That's fantastic. I love it. Well, a couple of more questions. What, in your opinion, is one behavioral science insight or concept that event professionals should apply immediately?
Just one?
Yes.
I think, and you've got materials on this on your website, anchoring is really important. So anchoring is not only important in pricing. So when we talk about anchoring, it's establishing expectations, because people need a frame of reference. And so Anchoring expectations, I think, is really important. So I'd start inquiring on that, particularly because price is such a point of tension when people are looking to book an event.
Okay, and my last question is, the podcast is called What If I Told You? So can you please complete the sentence with any one takeaway relevant to our conversation? What if I told you?
What if I told you that if you change behaviour, you can change your world?
Wow, that's perfect. That's perfect. I'm gonna, do that my tagline for the podcast.
No.
Thank you so much, Bri. I encourage everyone to check Bri's website and also social media, LinkedIn, connect on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I will post on all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Event Psychology podcast. For more brain science insights, I encourage you to join the Event Psychology Club. Thank you. Thank you, Bri.
Thanks, Victoria.
Bye-bye.